you know. Except we don't have Big Ben, but otherwise, it's like a vacation in the British Isles. So we were looking at utilitarianism. Remember, it had that scale. Basically, utilitarianism has us balance out the good versus the bad consequences for everyone affected by our actions, which means you have to essentially guesstimate what that's going to be for the future. And this is one of the drawbacks of it. We don't always know what the future is going to be like. As Professor Taylor pointed out in that video, we don't always know what the downside is. Think about the big dig in Boston, where it went over about 4 or 5 times over budget because they didn't anticipate all the problems they were going to encounter with trying to put a subway system, in the kind of soil they had and so close to the ocean up there in Boston. In other words, they couldn't see the downside as well. But if utilitarianism tells us via the principle of utility to choose the course of action that promotes the greatest good for the greatest number, that raises the question, well, what do you mean by good? And we saw that the utilitarians tried to respond to skepticism of people like Hume by trying to get moral reasoning down to earth. Basically, Hume left us with the sort of skepticism that says we can't reasonably argue over a moral matter. We can't reason about it. Morality for him is a matter of sentiment, not of reason. And all that matters, if I say stealing is morally wrong for David Hume, that just means, well, I, Victor Morawski, have a very negative attitude toward that, right? If I say, well, feeding the hungry, like in B. Gatti's ministry, is really a good thing to do, and I mean that as a morally good thing, then for Hume, all I'm doing is relating to you my feelings of approval for that. So morality for David Hume boiled down to just one person's feelings against another person's. And what the utilitarians tried to do is to say, no, there's got to be a way to reason about a moral issue in an objective way. So they wanted to introduce reasoning back into it. And the way that they did it was, as I said, to get ethics down to earth. And they said, you know what, if we can adopt this old view of hedonism, but give it a universal flavor, the old hedonists, the Epicureans, he's thinking more of the Epicureans than Aristotle's hedonism. They were mostly concerned with promotion of pleasure for oneself. But utilitarianism says, no, what we want to do is choose the course of action that on balance provides the most happiness or pleasure for everyone affected by our actions. And if it's a governmental policy, then for the whole of society, say if it's the federal government. So they define the good, as the old Greek Epicureans used to do, as the pleasurable, and they were hedonists. I think I talked So hedonism is the view that the only thing good for its own sake is pleasure or happiness. Bentham does not really distinguish between the two. And in other words, every other good is good only insofar as it ultimately promotes pleasure or happiness or lessens pain or unhappiness, but not in itself. Now, I mentioned that Mill's proof of hedonism doesn't work because he's trying to show that pleasure or happiness is desirable as the end to be promoted in our moral reasoning. In other words, we're trying to make those moral decisions that promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. That's the thing we ought to do, right? That's what he needs to prove. He needs to prove, in other words, to establish this type of hedonism, that pleasure is what we ought to desire in the promotion of pleasure and happiness, the lessening of pain and unhappiness. But what he does is he uses desirable in two different senses. In the premises, he talks about things like, well, the indication that a sound is audible is that it's able to be heard. Well, the indication that a pleasure is desirable or happiness is desirable is that it's what people actually can and do desire. You know, but that's the fact that people do desire happiness and lessening of pain does not show that it's what they ought to desire as the end of morality. And so Mill's reasoning falls short because he uses the key term desirable with two different meanings. So the premise doesn't prove the conclusion. In logic, we call this a fallacy of ambiguity. Well, the key word to keep in mind with Bentham, and what Bentham did for early utilitarianism is also something that frequently comes about even in scientific theories. So very often the first statement of a theory is very simple and straightforward, but then people bring up criticisms about the way that theory is stated, which forces one to make qualifications and revisions, and so the theory becomes more complicated. Originally, Bentham thought, wouldn't it be great if we could reason about pains and pleasures in a mathematical way? That is, say a judge has to decide on a fair sentence for a convicted criminal, and they want to use utilitarian reasoning, so they're looking at things like the rehabilitation of the offender, the protection of society, the deterrent factor of the sentence. And so years of somebody's life might weigh in the balance. Wouldn't it be nice if they had a very objective way of doing that, of working out, say, a sentence that is not so lenient that it doesn't protect society, doesn't deter, and probably, doesn't teach the offender a lesson in terms of rehabilitating them, versus, on the other side, a sentence that's way too severe for the crime committed. So this is the kind of thing that Bentham had in mind. Now, very often you can see a point better with a very simple illustration. This is a simple illustration of utilitarianism that I have used for years. I don't want to tell you how many years. But I got it out of the Edwards Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And it illustrates Bentham's calculating system, which is sometimes, I like the term hedonistic or hedonic calculus. Don't let, there was somebody with a calculus book in here the other day. Has nothing to do with the calculus that Newton and Laplace formulated, and where you have a book that's 3 or 4 inches thick. We're just talking about simple adding and subtracting positive and negative numbers. But he thought that we could assign numbers to pleasures and pains. And maybe I should go into these factors. There were 7 marks. I'll just mention some of them. You would think that an intense pleasure would get a higher positive number. He actually had a countable unit. In other words, if something's quantifiable, something's measurable, we need a unit of measure, right? I mean, we could talk about subjectively how warm it is in this room, but we can objectively talk about it by stating the temperature in the room in degrees Fahrenheit or degrees centigrade. So a degree Fahrenheit would be a countable unit, right, for measuring the temperature of something. So he thought we could talk about pains and pleasures using a countable unit he called the hedon. I like to say this is not something you can make up. This actually occurred. In other words, he thought that we could do this. And so +1 hedon would be a unit of pleasure, and -1 hedon would be a unit of pain, right? So here's the example. If you have the printout, everything's in it. But suppose you are a Bentham-style utilitarian, right? You want to make your decision using utilitarian reasoning. And in this case, you're deciding what's the morally right thing to do this Saturday. I want to stay home and read a book I enjoy. My nephew wants to go to the circus, and I'm the person who ought to take him because his parents are tied up that night. But I don't particularly want to go to the circus. But as a utilitarian, you're making your decision on the basis not just of how much personal pleasure or happiness you'll get from the experience, but in a way that talks about measuring the happiness for all concerned. The happiness calculus, hedonic calculus, hedonistic calculus, these are all names for Bentham's system. A calculus is just a system within which you can make calculations. So it has a broader meaning than just the calculus that people study. So suppose for you, the uncle, circuses are been there, done that, boring. You know, it's like you thought, well, it was fine when I was 12. In fact, I went down to a concert Sunday afternoon, and we were right across from the 5th Regiment Armory, and I was telling a friend of mine, well, you know, I used to go see the circus there when we were in elementary school. And she said, yeah, we did too. But you think, well, I'm not 12 years old anymore. You know, the circus doesn't excite me. So boredom is a mild pain, which gives you an idea of how Bentham means stuff like this. I started talking about the marks he thought we'd use. In other words, he thought we'd bring into account how intense a pleasure or pain was, right? More intense, a higher number, either positive or negative. How certain it was, how long, right? I mean, we got a multi-billion-dollar pain relieving, over-the-counter pain relieving industry here, you know, built around the fact that if your headache might last all afternoon, if you don't take something for it, but you can take, you know, a Motrin or Advil or something and get rid of your headache in half an hour, you're going to take, you know, a negative experience of lesser duration, you know, is preferable. So we thought we could take into account factors like this and assign numbers. So the uncle's boredom minus 5 hedons, right? Now, how many of you have ever had like a brother or sister and they get a birthday gift, or, you know, if you celebrate Christmas, they get a Christmas gift, and you get enjoyment just out of watching them, their eyes light up when they open the presents, right? We used to do that when we'd have, was talking with somebody as we were waiting for the other class to get finished, and, you know, we'd have like about 20 or 25 people at one time for Christmas over at my brother and sister-in-law's house, you know, and that was back when I would buy presents as Uncle Vic for a lot of my one niece and many nephews. But you enjoy seeing them get enjoyment. We call this sympathetic pleasure. If the nephew enjoys himself at the circus, then you'll get a certain amount of sympathetic pleasure out of that experience yourself. Let's call that plus 2 hedons. Not enough to make up for your boredom, but suppose the nephew really enjoys the circus. And gets plus 10 hedons worth of pleasure out of it. So for this, if we did the math, we've got plus 12 minus 5, which gives us plus 7 hedons on this side. So you say, well, okay, what's my other option? Stay home, read a book I enjoy. Well, suppose the pleasure I would get from reading is not quite as much as the pleasure, you know, I mean, children tend to feel things more intensely. So it won't be as much pleasure as the child gets from going to the circus, my nephew. However, while I'm sitting there reading a book Saturday, I'm going to have a little bit of sympathetic pain knowing that I have disappointed my nephew who wanted to go to the circus that night. And then, of course, factored into this is also the nephew's disappointment itself. Let's call that minus 8 hedons. He's really disappointed he couldn't go to the circus. So here you do the math, and on this side you come up with minus 4 hedons, or 4 hedons worth of pain. So what, for the utilitarian, would be the right choice morally?
Take him to the circus.
Yeah, take the little tyke to the circus. But notice something here. From the uncle's perspective, even though this is a morally right choice, we're talking about all affected. Now, you know, we could make this more complicated by bringing in the pleasures and pains, say, of the kid's parents. But note, the uncle's boredom is -5 hedons, but he himself only gets +2 hedons of sympathetic pleasure. So he's got a -3 hedons for himself in terms of his own pleasure, or in this case, a lack thereof. Whereas on this side, he's got +6 and -2 or +4 hedons. So this is the side that gives him the most pleasure and happiness, but he's not an egoist. He's not trying to make decisions solely from the standpoint of what benefits him, but he's a utilitarian, and he wants to make the choice that brings on balance the most pleasure or happiness for all concerned. So he makes this choice, even though it may not be the best for him. So this is an example of utilitarian reasoning. But the question is, can we really assign exact numbers to pains and pleasures this way? What do you think? In other words, is it obvious to everybody where we get these numbers? No, it's not obvious to you. You can't just see it. No, it's not, is it? I mean, pains and pleasures are subjective. So, you know, critics of Bentham's approach here say it's unrealistic to think that pleasures and pains can be really compared in this kind of an exact mathematical way. They're subjective, right? I can't see your pains and pleasures. I might see your behavior, but we can mask that, right? An athlete who gets an injury, but you know, may not want the coach on the sidelines to know just how bad his foot is hurting because he wants to stay in the game. You know, poker players, you know, we talk about a poker face. They try not to show their happiness of just having flopped a set and probably going to win the hand, or their unhappiness at the fact that, you know, they haven't gotten what they wanted. So pleasures and pains are subjective, not open to public inspection. In other words, there doesn't seem to be any objective way I can confirm. Now, hospitals, some of you are in medicine in one way, or want to go into medicine. Ever see in hospital rooms, they have a chart? Show us your pain on a scale of 1 to 10. But for the most part, that's just kind of a rough and ready estimate, right? If you as a patient say, well, my pain is only a 6 today, but doggone it, it was up to an 8 yesterday, is there, you know, I take your word for it, but there's no objective way I can look into your head and see, well, you know what? Her pain really is a 6 today, right? So there are problems with this assumption of Bentham's that we can assign exact values to pains and pleasures. Their subjective quality, or the subjective quality of pleasures and pains, also makes standardization of a countable unit problematic. What do I mean? If you looked at the kinds of measurement standards, like what a meter is, what a, you know, gram is, and so on. Some of these have very, very exact scientific definitions, you know. in other words, it's very clear what is to count as 1 degree Celsius or 1 degree Fahrenheit, right? But the question is there any objective, exact way we can specify what 1 hedon's worth of pleasure is or minus 1 hedon's worth of pain is? Not really, right? So that's why I say standardization of a countable unit, in this case the hedon being the countable unit, just seems, from a practical standpoint, impossible. Now, one reply, and you saw this in what Jonathan Glover said in the video. Now, I don't expect you to remember everything in the video. And I will give you a link to that if anybody missed it. That one is the only one from the series that's out there legally on the internet because it's the company's demo. So I had so much that I was doing yesterday, I didn't get a chance to do that, but I'll give you the link if you want to watch it again or if you want to watch it for the first time. So one response is to say, well, wait a second, though. You know, somebody understands me if I say, doggone it, my headache today is twice as bad as it was yesterday. You know, or my throat is much sorer today than it was yesterday, right? In other words, we do, in fact, make rough and ready comparisons of pains and pleasures, or like the scale of 1 to 10 in the hospital. We say things, you know, again, like my headache today is much worse. And so, yeah, we do compare and talk about pains and pleasures, but the question, though, is, does that mean that we can talk about them in the exact way that Bentham thought? And the answer pretty much is no, right? So we can't assign exact values to pains and pleasures. Now, Bentham had a famous saying. For Bentham, the word to keep in mind is quantity. He thinks we can compare pains and pleasures quantitatively. You know, how much do we have over here? How much do we have over there? Let's compare them and see which side has the most pleasure or less pain. And by the way, it does not have to be a positive versus a negative number. The right thing to do might be the side that has plus 12 hedons worth of pleasure over here versus only plus 4 hedons of pleasure over there. It doesn't always have to be plus on one side, negative on another. Or sometimes our decisions, I mean, life is not Sears Roebuck. Now, you all don't know this. I mean, that's one reason why Sears Roebuck is in trouble. But they were famous for giving customers the distinction between good, better, and best, right? You know, having different levels of quality for their various products, like a drill or a wrench set or whatever. But in life, the choice is not always between good, better, and best. Utilitarians often argue that euthanasia, mercy killing, or physician-assisted suicide ought to be permitted legally because they say, well, it's only a merciful thing to do. If somebody is allowed to opt for physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia, literally the word euthanasia, thanatos is a Greek word for death. We saw with eudaimonia is good. Literally means a good death. right? And so the thought is, well, if you can spare somebody in the final stages of a painful disease like cancer 6 months of pain and suffering, then even though it's a negative, you know, to be euthanized or to opt for physician-assisted suicide, there's less pain on that side than suffering excruciating pain for another 6 months. So on utilitarian reasoning, you can just be comparing a negative versus a negative, and the morally right thing to do for them is what's on the side of the least amount of pain and suffering. But because Bentham wanted to simplify things and thought that the only thing we needed to talk about with regard to pains and pleasures is their quantity, this subjected his theory to a lot of criticism, and I didn't put the pig in here. They criticized it as a view, as a moral position that gives us a very low view of human beings, that sees us just as creatures of pain and pleasure. And Bentham had a famous saying. He said that it's, what did he say? Oh, quantity of pleasure being the same, pushpin is as good as poetry. Pushpin is a simple child's game, from what I've read, something like pick up sticks. What is he saying? Well, he's saying, you know, if you get the same amount of pleasure from a simple child's game as someone gets from going to the opera or reading a classic novel, doesn't matter. All that matters is a quantity. And people said, well, this means that if human beings, if the pig out there in the field or in the barn eating slop gets as much pleasure from eating slop as you get from going to a classical music concert, right, or reading a novel, then all pleasures are on a par. And so how does this make us different from the pig in the field? So this is why Bentham was quite old when these criticisms of utilitarianism were rolling in. And so his pupil, John Stuart Mill, tried to kind of defend utilitarianism against these. And so instead of being a morality, that's obviously a piggy bank, not a pig, but at the time I did this, I wasn't going out on the internet looking for stuff. I don't even think I had it then. That was the graphic I had. But Mill said, look, we can make a distinction between human pleasures and the pleasures of the pig out in the field by bringing into play the notion of quality. Quality in pleasures matters, not just mere quantity. And I wish somebody would deprogram their robocall. Anyway, So Mill tried to make a distinction between higher pleasures, which he says are the pleasures of the intellect and the imagination. In other words, music and novels are creations of the imagination. Getting pleasure reading a philosophy argument. Pleasure of the intellect. So he claimed that uniquely human pleasures, like music and poetry, were more desirable even if they were lower in quantity. And his famous quote, which they gave in the video, is, "It's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool or a pig satisfied," right? In other words, it's better to have a lower quantity of a higher quality of pleasure, like the pleasure of discussing philosophy with people. But now, if that's the case, is Mill still a hedonist? In other words, he's trying to defend hedonism, but does he really abandon hedonism? Because if you come to ask, what is it about these higher pleasures that makes them more desirable, the answer can't be they give us more pleasure. It can't be pleasure itself. So Mill claimed to be a hedonist, but this move seems to abandon hedonism, because what makes higher pleasures higher can't be just pleasure alone. And so, in other words, why is it more desirable? And you know, Mill was right, I think, on this. I have 43 minutes after back here. Hopefully that's... I mean, suppose, look, we all have problems, right? You know, stuff, negatives in our life. Suppose somebody said, you know, I know you're going through a lot right now. I've been reading some books on magic, and I think I found out how to turn you into a pig. And not only how to turn you into a pig, but into a very happy pig. So, you know, I'm willing to try it out, and you'll get rid of all of these, you know, issues that are causing you some consternation, unhappiness now. Which one of us would take that deal? None of us would, right? Because you know that there are things that you can appreciate as a human being that the pig out there in the field knows nothing of. One of the other things Mill said is, we wouldn't trace places with the pig in the field. The way he put it in this flowery 19th century language was, for the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasures. In other words, even if somebody said, hey, but you're going to be a really happy pig, say, you know what, I'm going to pass on that. Right? And so, you know, but what makes these higher pleasures valuable? He seems must be some other standard sneaked in. Now, the reason this conflicts with hedonism is hedonism says there's only one thing, pleasure or happiness, that has value for its own sake. What this seems to highlight is maybe there are things other than pleasure that also have value in and of themselves, and not just because they promote pleasure or happiness. So this would undermine the hedonist claim that pleasure is the only ultimate standard of goodness. That's why, in trying to defend hedonism, Mill abandons it. And most contemporary utilitarians are like Jonathan Glover in the video. They're pluralists when it comes to a standard for moral goodness. They say there are a number of standards. And some of them have been things like knowledge, self-realization, satisfaction of our preferences. All of these by pluralists are viewed as intrinsically good. So this overtly abandons hedonism and recognizes, in other words, a pluralist can can agree with the hedonist that pleasure or happiness is valuable for its own sake. But then they would go on to say, but there are other things as well that are valuable for their own sakes, like some of the things in that list in the previous slide. So it denies the hedonist claim that pleasure is the only standard, the only, and recognizes other things as good for their own sake. Now, I should have pointed this out last time, but we'll look at this next time. But in fact, I need to re-edit it and move this slide to right after the one on pleasure. Modern-day utilitarians talk in terms of a cost-benefit analysis, and they interpret the morally good in terms of something that has more benefits than costs, say for society as a whole, in economic terms. So they hook up the accounting tool of a cost-benefit analysis with morality and say the morally good thing to do is what promotes the most benefits over costs for society as a whole. And this is what happens in a single-payer healthcare system. Healthcare is doled out by first trying to figure out whether if we spend $100,000 on your operation, we're going to get enough on the back end as a society to justify the cost. So, well, okay. We'll see you Friday, and we'll try to finish up this. And I gotta look and see when I have a review session and stuff. I've been so buried in term papers because I've been doing the Essex one. I haven't had much time to check other stuff. So thank you very much for coming. If you didn't get the roll, it's over here. Catch it on the way out. We'll see you.